Welcome to the skeletal system. So I'm going to break down a couple functions of the skeletal system and tell you guys what bones that you need to know. It's a really pared down lecture because this is just a trimester course. So I want to just make sure you guys have some of the basics. But you do need to know the functions of the skeletal system. So probably the more obvious one that people talk about is they're here for protection. Okay, it's going to protect everything inside of our body from any type of trauma. The next thing that people identify with is that it helps us move our bodies, right? We're able to stand up, support the weight of our body, and move all around and do all sorts of physical activity things every single day. The last three here that people don't necessarily think about is that our bones store and release fat right on the inside there, which is kind of cool. It's also going to store and release minerals, especially our calcium and our phosphorus, and it helps us produce our red blood cells. So two different parts when we refer to the structure of the skeleton. We have what's called the axial skeleton and we have the appendicular skeleton. So the axial skeleton refers to anything that's right along the axis or the center of the body. So those are going to be the bones of the head and the trunk. So if we look at it from the anterior or the front side, and the posterior or the back side. So let's break it down a little bit farther here. Axial, remember, right along the axis. So if we talk about each one, at the top, we've got our skull. Okay, our skull is going to protect our brain. The next one that you'll see on here is going to be your sternum. That's this guy right here. I referred to it in one of my previous videos. We also call that our breastbone. And you can see that the ribs attach right here at the base of our sternum. And then the big long column that we have there is called our vertebrae. And we're going to break that vertebrae down a little bit farther. So the vertebrae, or the vertebral column, we call it, has four different parts, well, five different parts to it. So we've got the cervical, which is our neck region. So you might have somebody who's had some type of injury at any of these spots. And so they refer to them based on their location and what number they are. So you might have someone who had a severed C7. If you had a severed C7, you would be paralyzed from the neck on down, okay? So that's the cervical has 7 vertebrae in it. The next one is our thoracic vertebrae. There are 12 of them in our thoracic vertebrae. And so you might say, somebody says, I have a pinched nerve at T4. I have a bulging disc at T8. And so you can see the discs are these little gray things in between. They're going to absorb some of the shock of the jumping and the movements that you guys do. And so sometimes people's discs are bulging, sometimes they've ruptured, sometimes people go in and they'll have their vertebrae fused. So they'll remove one of these discs in here and then they'll fuse maybe T7 and T8 together. It's obviously going to restrict some movement in that area. The next one is our lumbar vertebrae. So there's 5 vertebrae in there. L4, L5, you might refer to it if you have some lower back pain, would be in that area. And then the last 2 we don't talk too much about, but your sacrum and your coccyx. Your coccyx is your tailbone. So you might have had an injury when you were little where you fell and you crashed down and you hurt your tailbone or you bruise your tailbone. Sometimes they'll refer to that as well. A good way to remember the numbers, I'm not necessarily going to test you on the numbers, but if a lot of you guys had expressed that you're moving on to medical careers potentially, so a good way to remember the numbers is moving from top to bottom. So you have breakfast at 7, so there's 7 vertebrae in the cervical column. You have lunch at 12, so there's 12 vertebrae in the thoracic column. And then you have dinner at 5 in the lumbar vertebrae. Okay, the next one is my appendicular skeleton. And so the term appendicular refers to the appendages. Okay, so our appendages are our arms and our legs. So everything that does not revolve around our axis, but goes away from it, that is our appendicular skeleton. So let's break down the arms and the legs and the bones that are found in them. And I'll help you guys, give you little tips on how you can remember them, because you are going to have to be able to identify them on the exam that will be coming up. So the first one, I already brought this up. This is your clavicle. It's also called your collarbone. It's a pretty common injury to have people break their collarbones, but clavicle or collarbone is a nice thin bone right there. Pretty easy to break. Your shoulder blade on the back side of your body is called your scapula. Okay, so that big flat structure right there. The next one, the big bone in your upper arm is called your humerus. And now let's move down to your lower arm. Okay, and I'm going to put both of them up here. So these two bones, you've got the ulna and you've got the radius. So the radius is the bigger of the two. The ulna is the smaller of the two. Here's how you can remember them. So anatomical position, right? The palm is facing forward, which means your thumb is away. So your radius is always going to be towards the thumb. And how I describe it is the radius radiates away. So when something radiates, it's going to radiate away, where the ulna is on the underside of the body. So radius is radiating away towards that thumb. The ulna is tucked under. Okay. Your wrist structure in here is called your carpals. And then the metacarpals is going to be your beginning parts of your fingers. And then your actual fingers are called your phalanges. I'll let that pop up there for a second if you want to write that down. So your fingers themselves are your phalanges. The arrows are slightly off. So your carpals are referred to this actual wrist structure right there, okay? The palm of your hand is your metacarpals, and then your fingers are your phalanges. So I think this diagram has just shifted slightly where those arrows are at, so I apologize where they're at. So that is your upper limb. So let's talk about your lower limb or your lower leg. The first part, this kind of heart-shaped structure, is your pelvis. And you can see your coccyx comes right through the center of your pelvis. And then that hole in the pelvis, for us ladies, that's where the baby is going to come out of. The next one, the largest bone in your body, is your femur. So if you have someone who's got leukemia or they're doing a bone marrow transplant, any of those kinds of things, remember we said one of the structures of bones is that they help in red blood cell production. And so they're going to tap into your femur to get some of those red blood cells out of there. Your kneecap is also called your patella. And if you've ever experienced any type of knee injuries, sometimes they'll talk about you've stretched or you've torn your patellar tendon. So that's the big tendon that's going to connect your knee to either your femur or one of your bones down in your lower leg, either your tibia or your fibula. So tibia is the biggest bone, so kind of like your radius, okay? It's going to be the one that dominates there. And I'll put up the next one, which is your fibula. Again, my arrows are off, not sure why. But my fibula is this smaller one right there. So how can you differentiate between the two? Your tibia runs all along down the shin of your body, and it runs all the way to the tip of your big toe or your tibia. And then your fibula is going to be the smaller one that's towards the outside. So just like your hands, okay, a little bit different. We started out with our carpals in our wrists. In our feet, they're called our tarsals. The word tarsi is short for something that has to do with your feet. And so your ankle bones are your tarsals, which means the bones that are found in your feet are going to be your metatarsals. And then your toes, just like your fingers, are going to be called your phalanges as well. So here's everything kind of put together. There are some extra bones on this structure that you don't need to know, just those ones that I went through already previously. So for example, you don't have to know the ischium, the ilium, the sacrum, the pubis, any of those. You don't have to know the mandible. We typically don't call it the cranium, we call it the skull if we're just kind of breaking it down in remedial terms. Last thing I want to talk about are the types of bones. So there are 5 different bone types, and you're going to have to be labeling these on one of your structures just for practice. And so the first one here is called the long bone, right? So your humerus is a long bone, your femur is a long bone, your radius and ulna, your tibia, your fibula, all of those are considered long bones. Short bones are going to be the tiny little bones typically found in your hands. So all of these in here are your short bones. You've got flat bones. So your sternum is an example of a flat bone. Your scapula or your shoulder blade would be an example of a flat bone. The fourth one is an irregular bone. And so you can see your vertebrae is very irregular. It has all these knobs and shapes, all that to it. And then the last one is your sesamoid bone, which is an example of that would be your kneecap or your patella is your sesamoid bone. And that is it, ladies and gentlemen. That is your skeletal system. Make sure you guys are doing some studying, filling out those charts, and practicing.